A team of geneticists pulled DNA samples from over 40,000 people, stretching from Morocco to Yemen, from Egypt to Saudi Arabia. They expected to find what every textbook had been promising for a century: a clean, separate Arab genetic identity, a Middle Eastern signature standing apart from the African continent. What they actually found cracked the whole map open. Roughly half of the ancestry of millions of people who call themselves Arab today traces directly back into Africa, not somewhere vague, not symbolically, into specific nations, specific tribes, specific villages with names you can still find on a map. And the deeper the scientists dug, the more uncomfortable the story became, because it didn't just rewrite who Arabs are, it rewrote who Africans are too. And it raised a question almost nobody in either world wanted to ask out loud, so let's actually ask it. For decades, the dominant story has gone something like this: there are Arabs, there are Africans. Between them sits the Sahara, a kind of biological wall, and on either side of that wall, populations stayed mostly to themselves, mixing only at the edges. That's the version your school atlas implied. That's the version politicians on both sides of the Red Sea repeated when it suited them, and that's the version that genetics has now, very politely, set on fire. The big studies started rolling in around 2015. Researchers from Oxford, from King Abdullah University, from teams across Europe and North Africa, began comparing massive datasets, not dozens of samples, not hundreds, but tens of thousands. They lined up DNA from Saudi Arabia against DNA from Sudan. They lined up Yemenis against Ethiopians, Egyptians against Nigerians, Moroccans against Senegalese. And what came out of those comparisons was so consistent that even the scientists who ran the numbers had to double-check. Take Yemen. If you ask the average person on the street what a Yemeni is, they'll tell you Arab. End of story. But when geneticists looked at Yemeni DNA, they found that something like 30 to 40% of the ancestry of a typical Yemeni from the southern highlands lines up almost perfectly with populations from the Horn of Africa, Ethiopians, Somalis, Eritreans. Not a small smudge, not a footnote, a core part of who they are, and it isn't recent. The mixing happened so long ago that it's woven into the language, the food, the music, the very shape of the face. The Red Sea, it turns out, was never a wall, it was a highway. People rode back and forth across it for thousands of years, and they built families on both shores. Now move north. Saudi Arabia, the Hijaz region, the western coast where Mecca and Medina sit. You'd think this would be the purest, most concentrated Arab signal on earth. It's the heartland. It's where the language was born, where the prophet walked, where the tribes wrote their genealogies in poetry. And yet, when the genomes came back from the lab, Hijazi populations showed substantial African ancestry, particularly from East Africa and the Nile Valley. Some studies put it as high as 20% on average, with individual families showing far more. Scientists weren't surprised about the historical reasons. The slave trade across the Red Sea ran for over 1,000 years. Pilgrims came from every corner of Africa, and many stayed. Marriages happened, children happened. What surprised researchers was how thoroughly the genetic signal had integrated. There's no separate underclass marker, no fingerprint of segregation in the DNA. It's just mixed, fully mixed, generations deep. And then there's Egypt. Egypt is its own universe in this story. Modern Egyptians have been arguing about their identity for 2 centuries. Are they Arab? Are they African? Are they Mediterranean? Are they something entirely their own? The DNA gives an answer almost no one is fully comfortable with. Egyptians are all of those things at once, but the African component is heavier than the cultural narrative usually admits. Especially in Upper Egypt, the south, near the Sudanese border, the genetic continuity with Nubian populations runs unbroken for thousands of years. The pharaohs weren't a separate race that floated in from somewhere else. They were the same people whose descendants today are arguing on television about whether Cleopatra was African enough. The DNA shrugs at the argument. It says she was Egyptian, and Egyptian, biologically, has always been a bridge between the Mediterranean and the deep continent. Walk west across North Africa, and the story complicates again. Moroccans, Algerians, Tunisians, Libyans. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries brought Arab tribes into these regions, and yet the genetics shows something the conquerors themselves probably underestimated. The local Berber substrate held. The men who arrived from the Arabian Peninsula left a cultural and linguistic footprint enormous beyond all proportion to their actual genetic contribution. A Moroccan today might speak Arabic, identify as Arab, pray facing Mecca, and carry maybe 10 to 15% ancestry that actually traces back to the Arabian Peninsula. The rest is older, much older. Indigenous North African, Sub-Saharan African, through centuries of trade across the desert, a slice of Iberian, a thread of Roman. The Arab identity in the Maghreb is, genetically speaking, mostly a story about a language and a faith spreading across populations who were already there, mixing with people who were already mixing. So, what does it actually mean to be Arab? This is where the science forces a question that history has avoided for a long time. If Arab identity is genetic, it falls apart on contact with the data. There is no single Arab genome. A Saudi from the Najd, a Sudanese Arab from Khartoum, a Lebanese Maronite who identifies as Arab, a Moroccan from the Atlas Mountains, a Yemeni from Hadramaut. These people are not biologically the same group. They share fragments. They share patterns. But they share less, in many cases, than each of them shares with their non-Arab neighbors. And here's the part that turns the whole frame upside down. If Arab identity isn't genetic, then it's something else, a language, a faith, a shared cultural memory, a chosen belonging, which is exactly what the geneticists started saying, carefully, in their published papers. Arab identity, they wrote, is a cultural construct overlaid on a genetic mosaic. Which sounds dry until you realize what it implies. It implies that the line everyone has been drawing between Arab and African, the line that has driven politics, racism, slavery, war, marriage, taboos, citizenship disputes, entire centuries of self-image, that line, biologically, was always a fiction, or more precisely, a gradient, a long, slow blending with no sharp edge anywhere. Now turn the lens around, because the same studies that complicate Arab identity complicate African identity in ways that are just as uncomfortable. Take the Horn of Africa. Ethiopians, Somalis, Eritreans populations whose ancient history runs back to some of the oldest human lineages on Earth. The DNA shows that these groups also carry significant ancestry from back migrations across the Red Sea. People moved out of Africa, mixed with populations in the Middle East, and then their descendants moved back. The traffic ran both ways for tens of thousands of years. So, when a Somali woman and a Yemeni man stand next to each other, what genetics sees is not two strangers from two continents. It sees cousins, with a family tree that loops across the water again and again. Or take Sudan. Sudanese populations are sometimes presented as the cleanest example of African ancestry on the planet, untouched and ancestral. The reality is richer. Northern Sudanese Arabs carry deep Egyptian and Levantine signals layered on top of an older Nilotic foundation. Southern Sudanese populations are among the most genetically distinct groups in the world, with ancestry components that are quite literally found nowhere else on the planet at that concentration. The diversity inside Sudan alone is greater than the diversity between Europe and East Asia. One country, more genetic variety than entire continents. And this is something almost nobody understands about Africa, even people who live there. Africa is not a place. Africa is the place. It is the genetic origin point of every human being who has ever lived. Every population outside of Africa is essentially a small branch broken off from one African lineage roughly 70,000 years ago. We are all walking around with versions of African DNA. The differences between, say, a Norwegian and a Korean are smaller than the differences between two villages in central Cameroon. When you compare the Arab Peninsula to the African continent and find shared ancestry, you're not finding an exception, you're finding the rule. The exception would be finding no overlap at all. There's a moment in one of the recent papers where the authors essentially admit that the categories they were using when they started the project don't survive contact with the evidence. They began by sorting people into Arab and African and trying to see how those groups related. By the end of the analysis, they were arguing that those labels obscured more than they revealed. The data fit a different model entirely, a model where populations along the Red Sea, the Nile, the Sahara's edge, and the southern Arabian coast formed one giant interconnected zone for at least 10,000 years, possibly far longer. The labels Arab and African got bolted on later, by historians and by colonial mapmakers and by the populations themselves. Biology never agreed. This has practical consequences right now, today, in hospitals, in courtrooms, in how countries grant citizenship. When genetic medicine starts trying to use ancestry to predict disease risk, the categories Arab and African aren't precise enough to be useful for huge numbers of people. A Yemeni patient with sickle cell anemia and a Sudanese patient with the same condition might have inherited it through overlapping ancestral routes that no genetic ancestry app on the market currently models well. Researchers are quietly redrawing their reference panels because the old ones produced misleading results for anyone with mixed Red Sea or Saharan ancestry, which, it turns out, is most people in the region. There are political consequences too. Sudan spent decades convulsed by a war that was often framed as Arab North versus African South. The genetics shows that framing was always too simple. The northern Sudanese carry plenty of African ancestry. The southern Sudanese carry their own ancient genetic depth that owes nothing to anyone else. The conflict was real. The suffering was real. But the racial frame imposed on it imported categories that had no biological basis. People killed each other over a line that didn't exist in their cells. And in the Gulf today, you can watch this play out in slow motion. Saudi Arabia has citizens of every imaginable background, descendants of African pilgrims who never went home, descendants of Persian traders, descendants of Indian merchants, descendants of Yemeni laborers, descendants of Bedouin tribes who never left the peninsula. They are all, legally and culturally, Saudis. They are all, legally and culturally, Arabs. Some of them face daily discrimination from other Saudis because of skin color. Genetics looks at this and shrugs again, because the people doing the discriminating often carry similar ancestry to the people they're discriminating against. They just don't know it. Or they know it and don't want to admit it. The deepest implication of these studies isn't really about Arabs or Africans specifically. It's about the entire mental map we've been using to sort humans for the last few hundred years. The map has continents, and on those continents are races, and on those races are identities, neat and stacked. The DNA does not respect any of that. The DNA shows movement, mixing, return. More movement, more mixing. It shows that the categories are real, as social facts, and almost meaningless as biological ones. Which means the question "who am I" has no clean genetic answer. There's only the cloud of probabilities, the long story of every ancestor who walked, sailed, was carried, or fell in love across some border that mattered to them and stopped mattering the moment their child was born. So when scientists compared Arab DNA to every African nation and the results came back, the results that rewrote history, what they actually rewrote was bigger than either label. They rewrote the assumption that human populations are tidy. We are not tidy. We are a 400,000-year-old conversation between groups who kept finding each other, kept mixing, kept moving, and kept inventing new names for the same blended people. The Red Sea is not a border. The Sahara is not a wall. And the line between Arab and African was always more useful for politicians than for biology. The geneticists who ran these studies didn't set out to make a political statement. Most of them are quiet, careful people who measure things for a living. But the truth they uncovered has political weight, whether they wanted it or not. Because the moment you accept that Arab and African are overlapping cultural identities riding on top of a shared biological story, a lot of old arguments lose their ground. Who is the real Egyptian? Who is the real Sudanese? Who deserves to be called pure anything? The DNA answers all of those questions the same way. Nobody is pure, everybody is mixed. The mixing is the story. The mixing has always been the story. If this rearranged something in your head, if you came in thinking one thing about who Arabs are or who Africans are, and you're leaving with a different picture, go ahead and drop a comment with what surprised you most. I read them. Hit subscribe if you want more of these deep dive history meets science breakdowns, because there's a whole series coming on what genetics is doing to other identities we thought were settled: European, Indian, Native American, the whole list. And give the video a like if you think more people should see this, because the old map is still in a lot of textbooks, and the new one is more interesting, more honest, and a lot more human. We'll see you in the next one.